Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into inflation narratives versus relative prices. If you have ever wondered why your grocery bill jumps while your streaming subscription doesn't, or why headlines scream inflation even when only a few categories are exploding in price, this is your episode. In the next few minutes, we are going to separate signal from noise. We will unpack what counts as true, broad inflation versus what is really a reshuffling of prices across sectors. We will ask how uncertainty changes behavior, why averages can mislead, and how misdiagnosing the problem tends to punish the wrong people. By the end, you'll have a sharper lens for reading the news and a clearer compass for thinking about policy trade-offs. Let's start with why this conversation matters right now. The data have been jumpy. 1 month the consumer price index looks hot, the next it cools. Personal consumption expenditures tell a similar story. At the same time, parts of the asset world are euphoric, and global institutions have been blunt that uncertainty is the new normal. When the ground is shifting under our feet, it's tempting to reach for a simple story called inflation. But what if some of what we are seeing is not a general rise in the price level, and instead a few powerful shocks rippling through specific sectors? So here is the key distinction we will use throughout the video. Inflation, properly defined, is a persistent, broad-based rise in the general price level. In plain language, it is when money loses purchasing power across most of what you buy, not just a handful of items. Relative price changes, by contrast, are adjustments in the price of one good or sector compared to others. They happen all the time, and for good reasons. A frost in Florida can raise the price of oranges without telling us anything about the value of money. A new technology can make televisions cheaper relative to food. A shipping delay can make used cars pricier relative to clothing. The average of all these movements can go up, down, or sideways, but the story underneath often depends on which prices are moving, how far, and for how long. Why is this distinction so important? Because when we mistake a sector-specific shock for general inflation, or we dismiss broad inflation as if it were just a few noisy categories, we set off chains of bad decisions. Imagine imposing broad price controls because one commodity spiked. You might slow the visible symptom for a moment, but you also distort the incentive to produce, to invest, and to substitute. Shortages, queues, and quality declines tend to follow. Now flip it. Imagine tightening monetary policy sharply in response to what is really a bottleneck in a small set of goods. You risk cooling the entire economy to treat a local fever. Workers and firms far from the original shock pay the price, while the bottleneck itself can remain unresolved. There is also a moral dimension, even if we don't announce it as such. Who bears the cost when we misdiagnose? Households on fixed incomes feel a broad rise in prices intensely. Small businesses with thin margins cannot easily absorb a policy mistake that saps demand. Savers and borrowers experience the same policy very differently. When we call something inflation that is really a relative realignment, we risk shifting burdens onto people who are least able to hedge them. And when we wave away genuine broad inflation as if it were just a few bad apples, we risk eroding trust in the very signals that help markets coordinate. Here is a helpful way to think about it. Picture an orchestra. If every instrument gets louder together, that is inflation. If the trumpet section surges while the strings hold steady, that is a relative price change. Your job as a careful listener is to ask, which is it, and for how long? Another analogy. Think of a city map. A traffic jam on one bridge is a local shock, lowering the speed limit across the entire city is a system-wide change. Conflating the two leads to very different outcomes for commuters, for delivery schedules, and for the rhythm of the city. Finally, let's set expectations for how we will approach the topic from here. We will keep our language precise, and we will let the facts do the talking. We will focus on incentives and information, because prices are signals, and signals guide behavior. If we blur those signals with the wrong narrative, we invite unintended outcomes. And if we clarify them, we make room for better decisions, both private and public. No slogans, no hand-waving, just careful distinctions, real-world examples, and a steady question in the background: are we observing money losing value everywhere, or are we seeing the economy reprice itself in a few crucial places? That is the stage. Now that the terms are clear, we can start tracing how this distinction plays out in practice, why it has been misunderstood in the past, and what it implies for the choices we make today. Let's rewind to the early 1970s, because the distinction between inflation and relative prices gets its first big stress test right here. In 1971, the White House rolls out the new economic policy. It sounds calm and managerial, but on the ground it means a 90-day freeze on wages, prices, and rents. At the same time, the dollar's convertibility to gold is suspended. In practice, that closes the old Bretton Woods window and signals a regime shift. After the initial freeze, the controls return in phases with different labels and tweaks. The idea is simple on paper. If prices are rising too fast, pause them. If wages are racing to catch up, cap them. Like hitting the freeze button on a remote. Now, does that stop inflation, or does it hold a beach ball underwater? For a short while, the surface looks calm. Reported prices slow. But incentives do not freeze just because a policy says so. If you are a manufacturer and your costs are rising while your output price is capped, you have choices you do not like. You can cut quality, you can reduce quantity, or you can postpone production. If you are a worker and your wage is frozen while the cost of living creeps up, you start looking for side payments, new classifications, or a different job. And if you are a retailer with a line out the door, you start rationing with everything except the sticker price. Time, relationships, product mix, and backroom arrangements become the new currency. Shortages are not an accident in systems like this. They are the shadow the price ceiling casts. Then comes the oil shock of 1973 and 1974. Producers in the Middle East change supply conditions and the world price of crude jumps. That shock is not a blanket rise in all prices. It is a powerful relative shock, because energy is an input into almost everything. When the cost of energy rises, sectors that are energy intensive feel it first and hardest. Airlines, trucking, plastics, fertilizer, electricity generation, anything that rides on diesel or requires petrochemicals gets squeezed. Their prices need to adjust relative to less energy-intensive goods and services. That is what relative prices are for. They tell us where resources have become more scarce and where substitution is now attractive. But remember the policy environment. If you are trying to hold down prices broadly while a key input is getting more expensive, you create a collision between a real shock and an administrative rule. What shows up on the street are the gas lines and odd-even rationing days. What shows up inside firms are cutbacks, retooling delays, and a scramble to find loopholes that let prices reflect new costs without breaking the letter of the controls. What shows up in expectations is more subtle but more damaging. People begin to doubt that the posted prices mean what they used to mean. They begin to doubt that commitments made today will hold tomorrow. This is the credibility problem. Once households and businesses decide that the rules can change on short notice, they plan defensively. They bargain differently. They front-load purchases. They build in bigger cost of living adjustments. Lenders demand more compensation for the risk that tomorrow's money buys less than today's. And the longer that doubt lingers, the more inflation becomes embedded in behavior rather than just in a few hot categories. What did we learn from this period? First, broad price and wage controls can slow the thermometer without cooling the room. They buy time, but often at the cost of shortages, quality declines, and a messy search for workarounds. Second, when a genuine relative shock hits, like all in the mid-1970s, you want prices to communicate that scarcity clearly so that people can adapt. Muffle the signal, and the adjustment drags out and multiplies. Third, once credibility is lost, restoring it is expensive. At the end of the decade, the central bank tightens decisively. Inflation comes down, but the real economy pays a heavy price in the transition. The lesson is not that pain is virtuous. It is that regaining trust in the rules of the game is costly once trust has been squandered. So when we look back on the 1970s, we see more than a cautionary tale. We see a map. Administrative freezes can hide pressure for a moment, but the pressure finds outlets. Relative shocks need relative price movements to guide behavior. And credibility, once shaken, is not restored with a press release. It is restored with consistent actions over time that make promises believable again. Think of new money entering the economy like dye poured into a river. It doesn't color every drop at once. It starts where it's poured, spreads along particular channels, and only later reaches the wider current. That simple image captures the core mechanism behind what economists call the Cantillon effect. When money or credit expands, it reaches some people and some sectors first. The earliest recipients can spend at yesterday's prices. Their demand nudges up the prices of what they buy, and the incomes of the people who sell to them, before the rest of the economy has adjusted. By the time the dye has flowed downstream, the pattern of relative prices has already shifted. Where does the dye usually enter? Not out of thin air into everyone's wallet equally. It tends to flow through banking systems, bond markets, and government payment channels. That means credit-sensitive corners of the economy often feel it first. Construction, durable goods, commodities tied to investment booms, asset markets where leverage is common. Prices and wages do not all move together. Many retail prices adjust more slowly than auction-like prices for raw materials. Some wages are locked in by contracts or norms. The path the money takes matters. The timing matters. And the order of who gets to spend at what price matters. Now add the human element. Producers set prices with imperfect information. You run a small factory and notice your order book has filled up. Are customers clamoring for your product because it has become relatively more valuable, or because the value of money is quietly slipping? In the short run, it is hard to tell. You might hire more workers, buy more inputs, and expand shifts if you think the demand for your specific good has risen. But if the real story is that many prices are drifting up because of broader monetary conditions, your expansion is based on a misread signal. Later, when the fog clears, the extra capacity may not look so wise. This is the signal extraction problem. Prices carry two pieces of information at once. One piece is local and relative. The other is aggregate and nominal. In a world of perfect knowledge, every seller would separate the two instantly. In the real world, people see only their own corner clearly. They guess the rest. When the nominal part is moving in the background, short-run confusion is common. That confusion can turn into real choices about hiring and investment. And because real choices are costly to reverse, even a temporary misreading can leave a lasting footprint. Notice what this implies about policy. If actions in the monetary or financial system change the background nominal conditions in ways that are hard to read, then the economy spends more time sorting out which signals are real and which are noise. Relative prices need to be sharp to guide resources to their best uses. Blurring them with a confusing nominal backdrop is like dimming the runway lights just as planes are landing. You still get landings, but with more bumps and a greater risk of ending up in the wrong spot. A quick example makes this concrete. Imagine a credit expansion that lowers financing costs for homebuyers and developers first. Home prices rise relative to other prices. Materials linked to building get more expensive. Labor shifts toward construction. If broad money is stable and those relative moves reflect real changes in preferences or supply, the reallocation makes sense. But if broad money is drifting upward and the easy credit is the die entering upstream, some of the price and employment changes are signals about money, not about the underlying scarcity of bricks, land, or carpenters. When financing conditions normalize, the relative prices often snap back, and the projects that assumed the old signals were permanent have to unwind. The lesson is not that signals are useless. It is that signals are precious and should be kept as clean as possible. Prices do double duty as both measuring sticks and incentives. When the measuring stick itself is moving in ways people cannot easily see, we get more false starts, more overreactions, and more costly reversals. Conversely, when people can trust that the measuring stick is steady, they can treat unusual price changes as genuine information about real scarcities and opportunities. That is how relative prices do their job. Hold that mechanism in mind as we move forward. Money does not fall from the sky evenly. It flows through channels. People infer from the prices they see. And when the background drift of money blurs those inferences, real decisions can veer off course. That is the quiet power of mechanisms. They operate whether we notice them or not. Here is where the data starts to talk back. When people say inflation, they usually point to an average, like the consumer price index. But the average can hide the story. If you really want to know whether we are dealing with broad inflation or a few outsized shocks, you do not begin with the average. You begin with the spread. Imagine lining up the price changes of every major category in the index, from the biggest drop to the biggest jump. Some months that line looks tight, with most categories clustered near the middle. Other months it looks wild, with a handful of categories way out on the edges. That spread is dispersion. And historically, when inflation rises, that cross-section of price changes often becomes more dispersed and more skewed. In other words, it is not just that everything goes up together at the same pace. It is that a few categories move a lot, and they pull the average along with them. Economists noticed this pattern in the 1970s, when researchers documented a positive relationship between inflation and the variability of individual price changes across categories. Later work sharpened the point by looking at skewness, which tells us whether the distribution has a long tail of large positive movers. Think of a month when energy or food prices jump sharply while many other categories barely budge. The distribution is skewed to the right. That skew can nudge the average up even if most prices are moving modestly. Put simply, a few big relative shocks can make the overall index look hotter than the typical category actually is. Why does this matter? Because dispersion and skewness are like fingerprints. They help us diagnose what kind of episode we are in. If prices are rising broadly and relatively evenly, that smells like general inflation pressure. If the average is rising but the distribution shows a few massive movers and a long right tail, that smells more like relative shocks doing heavy lifting. Think about the 1974 energy shock. Energy-intensive categories leapt. Others followed at varying speeds depending on how energy fed into their costs. The distribution fanned out. Or think about the aftermath of the global pandemic, when used cars, airfares, and certain goods linked to supply chain snarls spiked far more than services that were not bottlenecked. Again, the cross-section widened and tilted. There is another reason to respect dispersion. It captures the real experience of households better than a single headline number. One family may spend a lot on gasoline and groceries, so the spike there dominates their month. Another family spends more on rent and healthcare, where changes are slower but persistent. If you only watch the average, you miss the lived reality that different baskets move differently. Dispersion reminds us that inflation is not a single fire. It can be a cluster of smaller fires, some blazing, some smoldering, each in a different room of the house. Now, a fair question. Could a rise in dispersion simply reflect that all prices are accelerating, just at different speeds? Yes, sometimes. The point is not that dispersion proves the absence of general inflation. The point is that it helps separate two dynamics that often get blurred. When a few sectors experience large shocks, the distribution screams it. When many sectors are drifting upward together, the distribution looks more uniform. That is actionable information for anyone trying to decide between broad tools and targeted responses. A quick mental exercise. Picture 2 months with the same headline inflation. In month 1, half the categories are up a little, half are up a little, almost no outliers. In month 2, most categories are flat, but a few are up a lot. The headline is identical, but the cause and effect story is not. In the first case, any broad policy lever you pull is more likely to hit the problem. In the second case, a broad lever may miss the bottleneck while imposing costs on everything else. Dispersion is your cue to ask better questions before acting. So the takeaway from the evidence is straightforward. Do not stop at the average. Look at the shape of price changes across categories. Is the spread wide or tight? Is the tail fat on one side? Which categories are dragging the mean? These clues do not tell you everything, but they keep you from telling yourself the wrong story. And in economics, avoiding the wrong story is half the battle. If the average can mislead us, what should we look at instead? Start with 2 simple tools that act like noise-cancelling headphones for price data, median inflation and trimmed mean inflation. Here is the intuition. The headline index is an average of many categories, which means a few wild movers can yank it around. Median inflation asks, what is the middle category doing once you line up all the price changes from lowest to highest? Half are above, half are below. It ignores the drama at the edges and tells you where the center of gravity sits. Trimmed mean inflation goes one step further. It literally trims away the most extreme gainers and losers on both ends and averages the quieter middle. If the outliers are driving the headline, these measures will quietly disagree. If the movement is broad-based, they will largely confirm the story. Why does this matter in practice? Imagine energy and a handful of bottlenecked goods are spiking while most categories barely move. Headline looks hot. Median and trimmed mean will often look cooler, signaling that the heat is concentrated. Now flip the situation. Suppose nearly every category is rising at a moderate pace with very few outliers. Headline and trimmed mean will hum the same tune. That agreement is your clue that the pressure is broad, not just a few noisy sectors. In other words, these measures help you decide whether to treat the patient with targeted care or a system-wide intervention. There is a second layer to measuring well, and it lives inside the index itself. A consumer price index is not a perfect cost of living measure. It is a carefully built basket with weights, methods, and compromises. The details matter. Substitution bias, for example, shows up when households switch from pricier goods to cheaper alternatives, but the index's weights are slow to reflect that switch. Quality adjustments try to account for the fact that a laptop or a car might be more capable than last year's model even if the sticker price is similar, but those adjustments are hard to estimate cleanly. New goods enter slowly, which can understate how consumer choices evolve when innovations appear. Even where you shop matters, because different outlets and regions face different price dynamics at different times. None of this means the index is useless. It means you should treat it as a starting point rather than a final verdict. Ask simple, disciplined questions when you look at the chart. Are a few categories dominating the move, or is the rise broad-based? Do median and trimmed mean confirm the headline, or do they hint at outliers doing most of the work? Are the basket weights and the methodology likely to exaggerate or muffle what households are feeling on the ground right now? Here is the payoff. When you measure well, you make fewer mistakes. Investors avoid overreacting to a noisy month. Policymakers reduce the odds of pulling a big lever to fix a small bottleneck. Households get a clearer sense of whether this is a moment to adjust habits or a moment to keep calm and carry on. Measuring inflation well is not an academic nicety. It is the difference between chasing shadows and seeing the room as it is. When a price moves, the first question is simple: is this a story about scarcity or a story about spending power? In other words, did supply shift or did demand shift? The answer changes everything about how we respond. Here is a practical way to think about it. Look at prices and quantities together. If prices rise while quantities fall, that looks like a supply shock. Something made it harder or costlier to produce or deliver the good, so the market clears at a higher price and a lower volume. Think droughts for crops, refinery outages for gasoline, port congestion for imported goods. If prices rise and quantities rise together, that looks like demand. More money is chasing the same goods, or people suddenly value those goods more, so both the price and the volume climb until the market catches up. Now scale that logic from one market to many. Category by category, pair price changes with measures of quantities, units sold, tonnage shipped, hours worked, seat miles flown, container throughput, appointment backlogs, even delivery times. Some of these are rough proxies, but together they tell a story. A month where a handful of categories show higher prices and lower quantities points toward supply. A month where most categories show higher prices and higher quantities points toward demand. The pattern across the economy matters more than any single data point. There are also timing clues. Supply shocks often arrive like bottlenecks, sudden, local, and physical. A canal drought, a factory shutdown, a failed harvest. You see wait times stretch, inventories drain, and firms triage orders. Demand shocks tend to arrive like pulses in spending, credit grows, order books fill broadly, and businesses first use slack capacity before running into constraints. One rule of thumb is to ask, did lead times lengthen before the price jump, or after? If the queue formed first, that smells like supply. If the cash showed up first, that smells like demand. A careful decomposition builds on these clues. Start with the expenditure weights of each category. For each one, classify the month's movement using a simple price-quantity sign test, then refine with extra evidence, delivery lags, order backlogs, hiring patterns, inventory-to-sales ratios. Aggregate the results into contributions to the overall price index, supply-driven share, demand-driven share, and a mixed or uncertain bucket. The goal is not to produce a perfect number. It is to avoid the wrong story. Why is this diagnostic so valuable? Because the remedies diverge. A genuine supply shock calls for adaptation, not a blanket break. You want prices to signal scarcity clearly so that substitution, conservation, and investment can do their work. You want the logistics folks to reroute, the engineers to retool, and the entrepreneurs to fill gaps. If you instead slam demand across the board, you cool everything, including sectors that were not the problem, while the blocked artery stays blocked. By contrast, when the pattern points to demand running ahead of capacity, broad tools can help: tighter financial conditions, slower credit growth, and a period of cooling that lets supply catch up without tearing the system. There is a distributional angle hiding here too. Misclassify a supply shock as demand, and you push down on employment and investment in places that had nothing to do with the original bottleneck. Misclassify a demand surge as supply, and you risk tolerating broad price drift that silently taxes savers and anyone on fixed incomes. Neither mistake is neutral. Both pick winners and losers. Of course, real life is messy. A supply shock today can trigger demand responses tomorrow. Households front-load purchases. Firms double order to secure scarce inputs. That behavior makes quantities jump even as supply is tight, blurring the signals. This is why a decomposition should never lean on a single month. Look at rolling windows. Watch how categories exit the hot list as constraints ease. If the same sectors stay hot long after the physical constraint has cleared, demand may be doing more of the work than you thought. One more practical tip: pay attention to prices that behave like auctions and prices that behave like contracts. Spot freight rates, wholesale energy, and commodity auctions will broadcast supply tension early and loudly. Contracted rents, administered medical prices, and regulated fees move slowly and often reflect earlier conditions. A good decomposition weights these differences. It treats some prices as the smoke alarm and others as the thermostat. The big idea is simple but powerful. Before you reach for a broad policy lever, ask the two-part question with discipline. Are prices up because capacity fell or because spending surged? Are quantities moving in the same direction as prices, or the opposite? Build the answer from category evidence, not slogans. The cost of guessing wrong shows up in empty shelves where you did not need them and empty paychecks where you did not intend them. Let's talk about a quiet paradox. You can have years when consumer price inflation looks tame, yet risk is building beneath the surface like pressure in a sealed pipe. How does that happen? Because the consumer price index is a window into the cost of everyday life, not a gauge of the financial cycle. When policy and markets focus almost entirely on that one window, they can miss the storm forming over the roof. Start with what CPI is and is not. It tracks prices of goods and services households consume. It does not include house prices themselves, only a proxy for the service of living in a home. It does not include stock prices, bond prices, or land values. It does not tell you if credit is expanding at a pace that loosens borrowing standards, or if collateral values are rising in ways that feed more borrowing, which then pushes collateral even higher. In other words, CPI is a snapshot of shopping, not a balance sheet X-ray. Now picture a period where interest rates are low and credit is easy. Mortgages get cheaper. Corporate borrowing costs fall. Investors reach for yield. What moves first are asset prices and balance sheets. Homes appreciate. Equity indices rise. Corporate bond spreads compress. As collateral values climb, lenders are more comfortable extending credit, and borrowers qualify for larger loans. That sets off a feedback loop. Rising prices beget easier borrowing, which begets more demand for the very assets whose prices are rising. None of this shows up directly in CPI. Your grocery bill might be flat even as the neighborhood's home prices gain 10% and margin debt ticks up. Why does this matter for an inflation conversation? Because financial cycles are long and powerful. They build slowly and unwind abruptly. If you steer the macroeconomy by CPI alone, you can find yourself adding stimulus into an expansion where credit conditions are already very loose. The household debt service ratio might be falling for now, but total debt could be climbing relative to income. Loan-to-value ratios might look fine on paper because collateral is rich, but that assessment depends on valuation staying high. A narrow focus on the consumer basket gives you comfort just as leverage quietly rises across the system. There is also a risk-taking channel to be aware of. When policy rates are low and expected to stay low, intermediaries with value-at-risk constraints can hold more risky assets for a given volatility. That pushes up prices and compresses risk premia. The same logic applies to households and firms using simple rules of thumb. When financing looks cheap and stable, projects clear internal hurdles more easily. You get more building, more buybacks, more acquisitions, more speculative ventures. Again, CPI is not designed to flash bright red when this behavior accelerates. It will whisper, not shout. You can hear echoes of this dynamic if you think back to episodes where inflation seemed well behaved while credit and housing were surging. It felt safe to many observers because the cost of a standard consumption basket did not look alarming. Yet balance sheets were stretching. When asset prices finally turned, the hit to collateral and the scramble to delever amplified the downturn. Notice the sequence. CPI lagged the story. The balance sheet damage arrived first, then the spending cuts, then the softer consumer price pressure. So what should we watch alongside CPI to avoid these blind spots? Start with broad credit growth relative to income. Track house price to income ratios and rental yields. Follow debt service and interest coverage ratios. Watch underwriting standards and the share of lower quality issuance in credit markets. Pay attention to duration mismatches and leverage in intermediaries that are not on bank balance sheets. None of these metrics tell you what milk costs this month. They tell you how exposed households and firms will be if asset prices stumble or financing costs jump. Here is the practical takeaway. Stable CPI does not guarantee a stable system. You can hold the average price level in check while inadvertently encouraging a composition of risk that is fragile. When that composition snaps back, the real economy absorbs the shock through layoffs, cancelled projects, and forced sales. If you want an honest conversation about inflation and its costs, you cannot leave the financial cycle out of frame. Prices at the register matter. Balance sheets decide how hard a stumble becomes a fall. When prices move, they do not land on a neutral field. They land on households and firms with different contracts, different balance sheets, and different clocks. That is why two neighbors can live through the same data and feel opposite realities. One feels relief, the other feels robbed. Let's make that concrete. Start with the most basic transfer mechanism. Surprise inflation shifts wealth from nominal creditors to nominal debtors. If you lent me $1,000 at a fixed rate, and the price level rises faster than either of us expected, you will be repaid in dollars that buy less. Your real return shrinks. If I borrow to buy a truck or a house at a fixed rate, my monthly payment stays the same in nominal terms while my income may drift up over time. My real debt burden lightens. Governments are large nominal debtors too, which means unexpected inflation quietly improves their real debt dynamics. No vote was taken, but a transfer occurred. Now look inside households. Balance sheets are not uniform. Some families own homes with fixed-rate mortgages and a slice of equities. Others rent and hold their savings in cash-like instruments. When broad prices rise, homeowners with fixed payments often hedge better than renters whose monthly costs can adjust quickly. If financial asset prices also rise in response to policy or to shifting risk appetite, the gains accrue to those who already hold them. The distribution of asset ownership is skewed, so a given move in equity or real estate prices does not lift all boats evenly. Meanwhile, retirees living off fixed nominal income streams watch purchasing power erode unless their benefits or annuities are explicitly indexed. The same macro shock, three very different households, three very different outcomes. Consider wages and timing. Not every paycheck adjusts at the same speed. Union contracts, public sector schedules, and salary review cycles can lag. Hourly workers might renegotiate faster in tight labor markets, but slower in slack ones. Professional services with pricing power can reprice retainers more easily than small shops bound by menu costs or fear of losing customers. If your income adjusts late while your expenses adjust early, you bridge the gap with savings, credit cards, or cutbacks. The bridge is not free. Spending baskets matter too. Lower-income households devote a larger share of their budget to essentials like food, energy, and rent. When relative price shocks hit those categories, the bite is immediate. Higher-income households spend more on services and discretionary goods whose prices may move differently. Even if the headline number is the same for everyone, the lived experience is not. A spike at the pump is a footnote for one family and a monthly crisis for another. Policy responses add another layer. When interest rates are lowered or balance sheets expand to stabilize financial conditions, one common channel is higher asset prices. That supports employment and investment, which can be good news for many. At the same time, it rewards existing holders more than future buyers and can widen gaps between those inside and outside the asset world. On the fiscal side, subsidies or price caps aimed at relief can mute the signal that scarcity needs to be addressed, prolonging shortages or shifting costs onto taxpayers or producers who cannot pass them through. Transfers targeted to households most exposed can cushion the blow without dulling price signals too much, but the design details matter. A blunt instrument can move a lot of money without hitting the mark. There is also a creditor health angle that often goes unnoticed. Unexpected inflation squeezes holders of fixed income claims. If those holders are banks, insurers, or pension funds that promise specific payouts, the squeeze can show up later in tighter lending standards, higher premiums, or pressure on defined benefit plans. The original surprise did not end with the monthly price report. It rippled through institutions that sit between savers and borrowers. A final wrinkle is the life cycle. Younger households are more likely to be borrowers investing in education, housing, and businesses. Older households are more likely to be lenders through bond funds, savings accounts, and pensions. The same inflation surprise that reduces the real weight of a student loan can reduce the real value of a nest egg. No moral judgment is implied here. The point is to see the mechanism clearly before deciding what is fair and what is effective. So who gains and who loses? Debtors tend to gain from surprise inflation, creditors tend to lose. Asset holders gain when financial conditions push valuations up, non-holders wait and watch prices run away. Renters are exposed differently than homeowners. Workers whose pay adjusts quickly fare differently than those locked into slow cycles. The pattern is not random. It is written in contracts, portfolios, and the order in which prices and incomes adjust. If we want to evaluate any policy or any episode honestly, we have to ask this distributional question up front. Otherwise, we risk calling a transfer a triumph or mistaking a burden for a necessary cost. There is a quiet temptation in economic policy that shows up again and again. In the short run, it is always tempting to promise a little extra heat for growth today, and then worry about the bill tomorrow. That temptation has a name, the time inconsistency problem. In plain English, the plan that sounds optimal when you announce it can be very different from the plan you want once people have acted on your announcement. And here is the rub. People learn. They anticipate the pivot. So the promise loses power, and you end up with the costs of instability without the benefits of surprise. Rules are the antidote. Not because rules are magical, but because they change incentives on both sides of the game. They tell households and firms, if X happens, the response will be Y, full stop. That lets people plan. It also ties the hands of the policymaker just enough to make today's promise believable tomorrow. Think of a thermostat with a clear setting versus a person standing by the heater fiddling with the dial every 5 minutes. One invites calm adjustments. The other invites a lot of dramatic gestures and uncomfortable swings. Now, rules can be formal or informal. Some are hard constraints, like legal mandates, tenure protections, or prohibitions on certain kinds of interventions. Others are transparent reaction functions, where the authority shows, over and over, that it responds to the same signals in the same way. The exact algebra is less important than the credibility that builds when words match deeds. Communication helps, but only if it is backed by action. Forward guidance without follow-through is not guidance. It is just forward. If you want a concrete case study in credibility, look at the regime shift at the end of the 1970s and the early 80s. After years of rising inflation and eroding trust, policy pivoted decisively. Money growth and credit conditions were tightened. Interest rates rose to levels that felt shocking at the time. The move was not costless. Output fell. Unemployment rose. But the sequence matters. For years, people had priced in the possibility that policymakers would tolerate higher inflation rather than accept short-run pain. When actions finally contradicted that expectation, the signal was unmistakable. Over time, inflation fell, and the economy relearned that nominal anchors would be defended even when it hurt. The lesson is not to applaud the pain. It is to acknowledge that regaining credibility after you have spent it is expensive. Spend less in the first place. There is also an information angle here that links back to our earlier slides. Relative prices are the economy's guidance system. They tell us where to conserve, where to invest, and where to shift effort. Discretionary policy that moves the nominal backdrop in unpredictable ways blurs those signals. It is like adding static to the radio while asking pilots to land in fog. A rule that is known, credible, and consistently applied keeps the measuring stick steadier. When a few prices jump, people can interpret those jumps as real scarcities rather than as the latest chapter in a moving target monetary story. Institutional design matters, too. Independence with a clear mandate reduces the pressure to chase short-run political goals. Transparent reporting and simple, repeatable criteria make it harder to quietly change the rules midstream. Narrow tools are better than sprawling toolkits that morph into credit allocation by another name. The broader and more discretionary the intervention, the more you risk entangling policy with the fortunes of particular sectors or firms. That is how good intentions slide into favoritism, and how favoritism erodes trust. Consider incentives at the edge of the system. If lenders and borrowers come to believe that large losses will always be socialized, they will take more risk than they otherwise would. If firms believe price caps will appear whenever a good becomes scarce, they will be slower to invest in extra capacity. If cities believe rents will be frozen whenever housing gets tight, they will face long lines instead of new construction. None of these outcomes require a speech about philosophy. They follow mechanically from the incentives baked into the rules, or the lack of rules. There is a final, practical point. The cost of restoring credibility is not linear. It grows faster the longer you wait. A small deviation from a rule corrected quickly is a footnote. A series of deviations justified by emergencies becomes a pattern. Patterns change behavior. Once behavior changes, it takes stronger medicine to move it back. That is why consistency, even when it feels boring, is a public good in monetary affairs. Boring policy creates exciting possibilities for everyone else. So the North Star on this slide is simple. Choose frameworks that people can understand and count on. Align incentives so that keeping promises is easier than breaking them. Preserve the clarity of relative price signals by keeping the nominal backdrop predictable. When credibility compounds, coordination improves, and the economy wastes fewer resources guessing what tomorrow's rules will be. Here is your field guide for telling inflation from relative price reshuffling, and for choosing responses that help more than they hurt. Start by looking beyond the headline. Ask what the distribution of price changes looks like this month. Is the spread wide or tight? Are a few categories sprinting while most are strolling? If dispersion and skewness are elevated, your first hypothesis should be targeted, sector-specific shocks rather than a blanket monetary story. Next, pair the headline with sturdier companions. Check median inflation and trimmed mean inflation. If they are cooler than the headline, outliers are speaking loudly. If they all point in the same direction, pressure is broad. This simple cross-check prevents a lot of noisy month overreactions. It is like triangulating with 3 landmarks instead of trusting a single compass in a magnetic field. Now diagnose the engine, not just the exhaust. Match prices with quantities. Did prices rise while quantities fell? That smells like supply. Did both rise together? That smells like demand. Layer in the telltale signals, delivery lags, inventories, order books, hiring. None is perfect, but together they sketch the mechanism. The point is not to worship a spreadsheet. The point is to avoid repeating the old mistake of swinging a sledgehammer at a bottleneck. Keep the financial cycle in your peripheral vision. CPI can be calm while credit and asset prices stretch. Track debt growth against income, house price to rent ratios, and underwriting standards. If balance sheets are doing something dramatic while the basket looks sleepy, adjust your narrative. Stability at the register can coexist with fragility in leverage. When the tide turns, it is the balance sheet that knocks people off their feet. Never forget the distribution. Before applauding any policy, ask who gains and who loses if you are wrong. Do fixed-rate debtors get an unvoted windfall? Do retirees on nominal income eat the downside? Do renters take the hit that homeowners hedge? This is not a political question. It is an accounting of contracts and timing. Seeing these channels clearly is what turns good intentions into good design. On rules and credibility, remember the simplest lesson. Predictable frameworks sharpen relative price signals. Discretion blurs them. A clear reaction function that people can bank on makes unusual price moves read as real information rather than as a guessing game about tomorrow's policy mood. Credibility compounds slowly and is spent quickly. Protect it. It is one of the few public goods that makes every private decision maker smarter at the same time. If you want a single sentence to take away, take this. Prices are knowledge. Let them speak. Measure in ways that separate the choir from the soloists. Diagnose causes before prescribing cures. And design institutions that keep promises, so that when a few prices must jump to broadcast real scarcity, the rest of the system can adapt without panic. Now, I would love to hear how this lands in your real life. Which prices in your world feel like genuine scarcity signals, and which feel like noise from elsewhere in the system? Drop your examples and questions in the comments. If this helped you see past the headlines, like the video so it reaches more people, and subscribe for more careful, entertaining dives into the places where history and economics meet. And if you want to go deeper into overlooked stories that challenge comfortable narratives, check out my book History They Tried to Erase in the description. Explore the channel if you enjoy thoughtful and entertaining history. There is a lot more to uncover, and I will see you in the next episode.